The Christmas gift I never received taught me more about my worth than 31 years of showing up ever did. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because when I say I received nothing, I don't mean I got socks instead of jewelry or a gift card when I was hoping for something more personal. I mean I sat at a table surrounded by 12 members of my own family, watched every single person unwrap something with their name on it, and then watched my mother fold her hands in her lap and look past me like I was a smudge on the wallpaper she'd been meaning to clean. My name is Bridget Reeves. I'm 34 years old. I work as a medical billing specialist in a mid-sized clinic in the city. I am not a dramatic person. I don't make scenes. I don't cry in public. I have spent most of my adult life being the kind of woman people describe as steady, dependable, quietly strong, the kind of woman who shows up. And I showed up that Christmas. I drove 45 minutes in holiday traffic. I brought a dish I'd spent 3 hours preparing the night before. I wore a red dress I'd bought specifically for that gathering because I thought it would make my mother smile. I sat in my usual seat, the one closest to the kitchen, the one nobody else wanted because you could feel the draft from the back door, and I smiled through every toast, every story, every burst of laughter. Then came the gifts. My mother, Gloria Reeves, is the kind of woman who makes gift-giving feel like performance art. She wraps everything precisely, ribbon curled perfectly, name tags written in her careful, looping handwriting. She calls each person's name like she's handing out awards, and everyone leans forward, delighted. There's theater in it. There's love in it. Or so I had always believed. One by one, names were called. My cousin Priya, my auntie Deborah, my younger cousins whose names I won't include here, neighbors who had been invited for dinner, even my mother's colleague who barely spoke to any of us. Each of them received something: a candle set, a necklace, an envelope of cash, a weekend away. My name was not called. I waited. I told myself she'd saved mine for last, a special moment, a private exchange later maybe when the room cleared. I reorganized my expression. I kept my hands folded in my lap the way she always taught me. I smiled when I was supposed to smile. I nodded. I did everything right, the way I had been doing everything right for 31 years. And then my Auntie Deborah looked at me, chuckled in that particular way of hers, warm on the surface, serrated underneath, and said, "Be happy we still remember your name." The room laughed. My mother said, "Be grateful you can sit here." I nodded. I don't know why I nodded. It was a reflex, the nod of a woman trained to absorb impact without flinching. But something happened in that moment. Underneath the nod, underneath the rehearsed composure, something I had been pressing down for decades finally stopped moving. Not broke, not shattered, just stopped. Like a clock that decides it has measured enough time. What hurt most wasn't the empty hands. It was that nobody in that room looked uncomfortable. Not one person shifted in their seat. Not one cousin glanced away. The laughter was easy and complete. And in that completeness, I understood something I hadn't let myself understand before. This was not an accident. This was a climate. And I had been living in it so long, I had mistaken it for normal weather. Before we dive into how I set myself free, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story is genuinely speaking to you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. Now let me take you back to where it all began. I used to believe that family was the architecture of a person, the bones beneath everything else. You could build a career, a home, a life, but the family you came from was the foundation, and if you understood your foundation, you understood yourself. That belief did not come from nowhere. It came from specific, vivid, real things. It came from my mother's hands braiding my hair on Sunday mornings when I was 7, the smell of the shea butter she worked into each section, the way she hummed without realizing she was humming. It came from the kitchen table where she helped me with fractions until 11 o'clock at night because my teacher had moved on without me and she refused to leave me behind. It came from a specific Tuesday when I was 9 years old, and a girl at school had told the entire class I smelled like cooking oil, and I came home devastated. I remember my mother pulling me onto her lap, I was almost too big for it by then, and whispering, "The ones who mock what they don't have will spend their whole lives mocking. Don't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. You just become." I held on to that sentence for 25 years. I became. I became responsible. I became the liable. I became the daughter who called every Sunday without being asked, who remembered every birthday, who drove to the family home whenever something broke down or needed organizing, or simply whenever someone's voice on the phone suggested they were lonely. I became the person who quietly paid for my younger cousin's school supplies 2 years running when my Aunt Deborah's hours were cut and told no one. I became the person who sat with my mother through her health scare in 2019, sleeping in a hospital chair for 3 nights in a row, going directly from that chair to work without complaint. I did not do these things expecting a reward. I want to be clear about that. I did them because I genuinely loved my family, because I had been raised to believe that love was expressed through presence and sacrifice, because I thought that was the language we all spoke. What I didn't understand then, what took me 31 years to understand, was that in some families, sacrifice is not the language of love. It is the language of hierarchy. And the people at the top of that hierarchy do not sacrifice. They receive. The people at the bottom sacrifice. And if you sacrifice quietly and consistently enough, you teach everyone around you that your sacrifice costs nothing, that your comfort is negotiable, that your presence can be taken for granted so thoroughly that one day in a room full of people who share your blood, not one of them will think to write your name on a gift tag. But I am getting ahead of myself. There was a season, a long one, when I genuinely believed the love was mutual and whole. My Auntie Deborah could be funny in a way that filled a room. She had a gift for voices, for timing, for finding the comedic thread in any situation and pulling it until everyone was breathless with laughter. At family gatherings in my childhood, I would position myself near her specifically because the air around her felt lighter. She called me Bridge, the only person who used that nickname, and when she said it, it felt like belonging. My cousin Priya, who is 2 years older than me, was my closest ally through childhood. We shared a bedroom at family holidays, stayed up whispering long after everyone else slept, built elaborate plans for our futures that involved living next door to each other in houses with connecting gardens. She was the first person I told when I got my first professional job. She cried. Actual tears. She held my face in her hands and said, "I always knew you'd do it. I always knew." These are not invented memories. I kept a ledger. Not a diary, I've never been sentimental in that way. More like a record. Dates, events, exact words people said. I started keeping it at 22, almost by accident, after realizing I had a habit of second-guessing my own memory when someone in my family denied saying something I was certain they'd said. The ledger was not born from suspicion. It was born from self-protection, the kind you engage in before you fully understand what you're protecting yourself from. Looking back through it now, I can trace something in those early pages, a warmth, a genuine record of connection, Sunday dinners that ran long because nobody wanted to leave, a birthday surprise they organized for me at 25, everyone crowded into my small apartment with balloons and the specific cape I'd mentioned once in passing. The year my mother drove to the city at midnight when my car broke down. No complaint, no lecture, just showed up. That was real. I'm not willing to revise history into something cleaner than it was. There was genuine love in those years, and that is precisely what makes what came after so difficult to explain.
because the cruelest betrayals are not the ones that arrive from enemies. They arrive from people who were once, in undeniable and specific ways, wonderful to you. They knew exactly where the load-bearing walls were. They'd helped build them.
It didn't begin with a single moment. I want to be careful here because there's a temptation when you're telling this kind of story to identify a clean turning point, a before and after, a door that swung shut. But the truth is less cinematic and therefore more insidious. The truth is that it began as a texture change, something in the fabric of our interactions that became, almost imperceptibly, rougher. I was 27 when I first noticed it. I had just received a promotion at work, not a dramatic one, but a genuine step forward that I was proud of. I called my mother on a Sunday, as always, and mentioned it near the end of our conversation. There was a pause. Then, "Well, don't let it go to your head." I laughed. I filed it under practical maternal wisdom. She was like that, I told myself. No nonsense, not given to excessive celebration. That was simply her way. But then, 3 weeks later, Priya was promoted at her own job, and the family gathering my mother organized in response featured a cake with Priya's name on it and a card signed by everyone. I told myself it was different. Priya's promotion was more significant. The timing was simply better. There were a dozen rational explanations, and I reached for all of them in turn, the way you reach for something in the dark, not because you're certain it's there, but because the alternative to finding it is too disorienting to consider. The comments began to find a rhythm. They were never outright cruel. That's the important thing to understand. Cruelty you can name. Cruelty gives you permission to push back, to draw a line, to say, that was wrong and here is why. What I was experiencing was subtler. It was the specific art of the remark that, repeated back to anyone outside the room, would sound perfectly reasonable. At a family dinner when I was 29, I mentioned I'd been considering buying my first property. My mother listened, then turned to Deborah and said, "She's always had big ideas." The way she said it, not unkindly, almost fondly, made it land like a gentle correction, like I was a child who had announced I wanted to be an astronaut and the adults were managing my expectations. Deborah had picked up the thread. Remember when she thought she was going to be a lawyer? Laughter, warm, inclusive laughter that somehow left me standing outside it. I had, at 20, briefly considered law school before choosing a different path. This was not a failure, it was simply a decision. But in the retelling, it had become a running joke about the distance between my reach and my grasp. I watched this happen at gathering after gathering, the gentle diminishment, the remark delivered with a smile, the laughter that followed, and the way the laughter made the remark feel affectionate, so that anyone who objected would seem oversensitive. Priya's role in this was the most complex to name. She never initiated, she was not mean-spirited in any obvious way, but she laughed, every time. And in a family system where Deborah set the tone and my mother ratified it, Priya's laughter was currency. It paid for her position at the center of things. And her position at the center of things required, perhaps not consciously, perhaps not deliberately, that someone else remain at the edges. I began to notice my contributions to conversations going unacknowledged, only to be repeated by someone else moments later and received with enthusiasm. I noticed that when I arrived at family gatherings, the room didn't shift the way it shifted when certain others arrived. I was furniture, comfortable, expected, unremarkable. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that family dynamics are complicated, and I was projecting. I had a therapist for 6 months at 31. I stopped going because I felt guilty spending money on myself, which, I now recognize, tells you everything you need to know about the state I was in. The last thing that happened before the Christmas that changed everything was small by any external measure. I had a difficult week at work, a billing audit that consumed 70 hours of my energy across 10 days. I called my mother on the Sunday after it concluded, exhausted, and said simply, "It's been a really hard week." She said, Deborah's knee has been acting up again." We spent the rest of the call discussing Deborah's knee. I hung up and sat very still in my apartment for a long time.
And for the first time, truly the first time, I did not reach for a rational explanation.
Christmas that year was held at the family home, as it always was, my mother's house. Gloria Reeves was 61 years old, still vigorous, still entirely in command of her domain. She had decorated with the precision she brought to everything, the garlands measured and symmetrical, the candles at exactly the right intervals along the mantel, the table set like a photograph waiting to be taken. I arrived at 2 in the afternoon. I had my dish, a slow roasted lamb with herbs I'd spent the previous evening preparing because food was one of the ways I had always shown love in this family. The kitchen was where my mother and I had once been most ourselves with each other, and I still believed, at that point, that cooking something carefully was a form of communication she would receive. She accepted the dish without looking at me directly. She was coordinating, managing. I understood. I set myself to being useful, the way I always did, refilling drinks, helping the younger cousins find their seats, carrying things between kitchen and table. I moved through the house quietly and efficiently, and nobody commented on it because it was simply what Bridget did. I was the infrastructure of our gatherings, and infrastructure is not thanked, it is simply expected to function. Dinner was genuinely lovely. The food was good, the wine was flowing. My mother made a toast that referenced the year's blessings with the kind of eloquence she was capable of when she chose to be. There were 12 of us at the table. Auntie Deborah was in particularly good form, her humor sharp and generous, and even I laughed genuinely at 2 of her stories. Then, the gifts. I want to describe this slowly because I think it matters. The way time behaves differently in moments of significant pain. Slower, more granular, each detail etching itself into memory with a precision that ordinary moments never achieve. My mother rose from her chair with the authority of a conductor approaching the podium. She moved to the sideboard where the gifts were arranged, and she began. She called names the way she always had, with ceremony, with warmth. She pressed each gift into each person's hands with a deliberateness that said, "I thought about you. I chose this specifically for you. You are seen." Priya received a necklace. I watched her open it. Her eyes filled. She stood and hugged my mother and said something in her ear, and my mother laughed the way she used to laugh when I was very young and she found something genuinely delightful. Deborah received an envelope. She opened it, raised her eyebrows in appreciation, and tucked it into her jacket with a nod that communicated satisfaction. The neighbor's children received small things. The colleague received something. The younger cousins received. The name on the sideboard reduced one by one until there were no more packages. My mother returned to her seat. I sat with my hands folded, waiting, certain, still, that there had been a miscalculation, an oversight, something she'd kept separate, something she was about to produce with a small smile and an explanation. She picked up her glass of wine. She did not look at me. The room had settled into the comfortable noise of appreciation, paper being folded, things being admired and passed around for inspection. Nobody was watching me, nobody was marking this moment, and perhaps that was the most precise cruelty of it, that the absence of my name was so unremarkable to everyone else present that it didn't even create a ripple. It was Deborah who broke the specific silence of my waiting. She glanced at me, not unkindly, her expression even a little amused, the way you might look at someone who is waiting for a bus on a day when the service has been canceled, and she said, "Be happy we still remember your name." The laughter that followed was immediate. Not vicious, not even intentional, the easy, reflexive laughter of people who have been trained by years of Deborah's humor to laugh at Deborah's timing. And then my mother set down her glass and said, pleasantly, in a voice that carried no particular weight, "Be grateful you can sit here." I nodded. I still, to this day, cannot fully explain the nod. It was the body's muscle memory overriding the mind's emergency signals. It was 31 years of training compressing into a single, small, devastating gesture of acceptance. But underneath it,
Underneath the nod, underneath the folded hands, underneath the expression I kept carefully assembled for the remainder of that dinner, underneath all of it, something that had been very slowly draining away for a very long time finally reached empty. I drove home that evening in complete silence. Not crying. I was not capable of crying yet. I was doing something more fundamental than crying. I was sitting at 60 miles per hour on a dark highway with the first completely unmediated view of my life I had ever allowed myself. No rationalization, no interpretive charity, no reaching in the dark for an explanation that would make it bearable. Just the thing itself, exact and finally undeniable. I sat in my parked car outside my apartment building for 40 minutes, and then I went inside, and I opened my ledger, and I read it from the beginning. I'm going to stop here for a second. If this story is resonating with you, if you've ever felt the particular pain of being invisible to the people who are supposed to see you most, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It genuinely lets me know that sharing these hard stories is worth it. Now let's keep going.
I did not call my mother on the Sunday after Christmas. This was, in 31 years, the first Sunday I had not called. I want to give that its full weight. 31 years of Sundays. Sundays when I was ill, Sundays when I was exhausted, Sundays when I had worked a double shift and could barely hold my phone. I had always called. It had never occurred to me not to call, the way it never occurs to you not to breathe. It was simply what I did. I sat with my phone in my hand that Sunday morning for a long time, and then I set it down and I made coffee, and I sat by my window and watched the street below in the thin winter light. And I felt something I didn't have precise language for yet. Something between grief and clarity, which I would eventually understand were not opposing states, but deeply related ones. My mother called me that evening. I didn't answer. She didn't leave a voicemail, which told me something. The week that followed was the strangest of my adult life. I went to work. I did my job with my usual precision. I spoke to colleagues, managed the afternoon audit cycle, ate lunch at my desk on 2 of the 5 days. On the surface, everything was exactly what it always was. Inside, I was entirely elsewhere. I was sitting at that Christmas table over and over, watching the packages reduce, hearing the laughter, feeling the nod move through my body. I also did something else that week, something I want to describe carefully because it's important to understand the specific state I was in when I made the decisions I made. I was not angry. I want to be precise about this because the word angry suggests heat, urgency, irrationality, and I was none of those things. I was something colder and more permanent. I was decided. I pulled out every document I had been quietly accumulating over the preceding 18 months. My grandmother, my father's mother, who had died 4 years prior, had left behind a small estate that had been poorly managed and largely ignored by the extended family. Through her lawyer, who had contacted me specifically because I was listed as a beneficiary, I had spent the previous year and a half working through the legal process of properly claiming what she'd left me. It was not a fortune, but it was enough. It was enough to do specific, deliberate, structural things. I had already registered a business, a medical billing consultancy, operating under a name nobody in my family would recognize. I had already opened a separate account. I had already had several conversations with an attorney, a woman named Patricia, who was thorough and patient and asked exactly the right questions. We had been building toward something without rushing it. I had been waiting to know if it was necessary. After that Christmas dinner, I knew. The family fracturing began about 5 days in when Priya called. I answered because I was curious. "Are you all right? Your mum mentioned you haven't called."
I'm fine, I said. She's a bit worried.
I let that sit in the air between us for a moment. My mother, who had watched me sit giftless at her table while 12 people received things she had chosen for them, was worried because I had not called on a Sunday. "Tell her I'm fine," I said. "Priya," I said her name quietly, "at Christmas dinner, did you notice what happened?" There was a pause, a long one, and in that pause I heard the thing I needed to hear, which was not denial or confusion, but the particular silence of a person who knows exactly what you're referring to and is deciding how to navigate it. "It was just a joke," she finally said. "You know how Auntie Deborah is." "And my mother?" Another pause. "She didn't mean anything by it." I thanked her for calling. I said goodbye. I did not call her back. Deborah called 2 days later. I did not answer. She left a voicemail that was, I'll grant her, genuinely warm in tone. She called me Bridge. She said she hoped I was doing well. She said she'd been thinking about me. She didn't mention Christmas. She asked me to call her back. I transcribed the voicemail into my ledger and filed it. My mother called 3 more times that week. Each time I watched her name appear on my screen, and I made a deliberate decision. I was not punishing anyone. I want to be clear about that, because punishment suggests a goal of making someone suffer, and that was not my intention. I was simply, for the first time in 31 years, declining to manage someone else's comfort at the expense of my own. The depression, when it came, surprised me with its physicality. I had expected grief to arrive as a feeling. Instead, it arrived as weight, a genuine, specific heaviness that made getting out of bed in the morning a task that required negotiation. I would lie in the dark before my alarm and have a silent conversation with myself about the immediate value of vertical movement. Some mornings I won the conversation quickly. Some mornings it took an hour. I ate badly for about 3 weeks. Not dramatically, I wasn't skipping meals or binging. I just stopped caring what I ate, which for someone who cooked with care and attention was its own particular symptom. I ate convenience food over my kitchen counter, not bothering with a plate. But there were also other things. On the 12th day of January, I received a confirmation email from the business registry. My consultancy was officially operational. I read the email 3 times, and then I felt something warm move through the heaviness for the first time since Christmas. Small, real. I printed the email, I wrote the date in my ledger, and I went to bed that night earlier than usual, and slept for the first time in 2 weeks without interruption. 1 week later, my doorbell rang at 9 a.m. on a Saturday. I looked through the peephole. My mother, Priya, Deborah, standing at my door. My mother's face set in an expression I recognized, the one she wore when she had decided that something needed to be addressed on her terms and her timeline. I heard their voices rise before I had even opened the door. "Open up, we need to talk, please." The please was new. I stood in my hallway in my robe, coffee in hand, and considered my options for approximately 10 seconds. Then I opened the door. "Come in," I said. "I've been expecting this conversation." They came in the way people do when they're prepared for resistance and encounter something worse. Composure. I had set 3 cups on the kitchen table before I opened the door. I sat down. I gestured. They sat. My mother looked around my apartment as she always did, cataloging things, comparing them to some internal standard. Then she looked at me. "You've been ignoring us," she said. "I've been taking time," I said. "Time for what?" "To decide what I want the next part of my life to look like." Deborah said, "We were just joking at Christmas, Bridge, you know that." "I know," I said. "I've known for a long time." That stopped them, because it changed the shape of the conversation entirely. This was not a woman who had been wounded by a single joke. This was a woman who had identified a pattern, named it, and had been preparing her response with the careful patience of someone who no longer operates on anyone else's schedule. I want to be honest about what healing actually looked like, because I think there's a cultural habit of presenting it as more linear than it is. It was not a montage. It was not a series of breakthrough moments stacked tidily, one behind the other. It was messy. It was incremental. It was occasionally boring, which nobody warns you about. The tedium of healing. The days when you are neither broken nor recovered, but simply waiting at a kind of interior bus stop, not yet certain where you're going. I went back to therapy, a different therapist this time, a woman who had a specific approach to family estrangement and identity reconstruction that my first therapist hadn't offered. She did not tell me what to feel or who to forgive. She asked me questions. Specifically, she asked me what I believed I deserved, and when I gave her my first answer, she asked me to give her another one, and another one, until we had worked our way through the performance of worthiness I'd constructed and arrived at something underneath it that was quieter and more fundamental. What I found there, underneath all of it, was a person who had been extraordinarily resourceful, not in spite of her family, but partly because of them. The habits I'd built in response to being overlooked, the meticulous record-keeping, the financial discipline, the quiet accumulation of skills and professional relationships, had, without my fully realizing it, made me someone with significant structural independence. I had built an escape route without knowing I would need one, which means some part of me had always known. The business grew faster than I expected. I had a specific professional skill set, and I had, over a decade in my industry, built genuine and lasting relationships with people who respected my work. 3 former colleagues became my first clients within the initial month of operation. By March, I was billing more per hour as a consultant than I had earned in 2 weeks at the clinic. I reduced my clinic hours. By June, I had resigned entirely. I did not announce this to my family. The healing work I did during this period was not all professional. I cooked again, really cooked, with care, with time, for myself, and occasionally for friends. I learned that I had been using food as a love language in a family that did not speak it back to me, and that redirecting that language toward myself and people who could receive it was not indulgence, but nutritional necessity. I started eating at my table with a proper plate, lit candle optional. I called an old friend I had neglected through years of prioritizing family obligations. She answered without hesitation. We spoke for 3 hours. She told me she'd missed me. I believed her, because her missing me had never required anything from me in return. And then there was the legal piece. My grandmother's estate had included, among other things, a small commercial property in the neighborhood where my mother's family had lived for 3 generations. It had been rented by a local business for years. The rent had been collected by a family member who had appointed himself informal administrator following my grandmother's death, with no legal standing and no formal accounting. My attorney, Patricia, had been building a very clear picture of the situation for 18 months. When we filed, it was not dramatic. It was paperwork. It was evidence. It was the legal system processing facts in the orderly way it does when someone has taken the time to organize those facts clearly. The hearing was not attended by my family. They were informed. The commercial property was transferred. The outstanding rental income was assessed. The informal administrator, a family member I've chosen not to name here, was required to provide an accounting. This is what they came to my door about. Not Christmas, not the missing gift, not 31 years of invisible labor. The property. And that told me everything I needed to know about the precise location of their care. The conversation at my kitchen table lasted 40 minutes. My mother cried once, genuinely, I believe. There is a part of me that will always love her, specifically and painfully, and her crying activated that part. But love and clarity are not mutually exclusive,
and I had learned to hold both at once without letting one dissolve the other. "Why didn't you say anything?" Priya asked. "About Christmas? About how you were feeling? We could have talked about it." I thought about the Sunday I'd called and mentioned my hard week, and we'd spent the call discussing Deborah's knee. I thought about the promotion cake that hadn't been baked for me. I thought about 31 years of nodding. "I'm talking now," I said. I still have that ledger. I added one final entry in January, the morning after the family came to my door. 3 lines. The date, the duration of the conversation, and this. They asked why I hadn't said anything. I said I was talking now. I think about the woman who sat at that Christmas table in a red dress she'd chosen because she thought it would make her mother smile. I think about the nod. I used to be ashamed of the nod. I used to wish I had done something different, stood up, walked out, said something sharp and exact that would have cut through the theater of that moment and forced an honest reckoning right there and then. But I've made my peace with the nod, because the nod was not weakness. The nod was the last gesture of a woman who had been performing accommodation for so long she no longer had access to alternatives. And in that moment, in that limitation, the performance reached its natural conclusion. The show had run its full run. The theater was closing. What followed the nod, the silence on the highway, the parked car, the ledger read from the beginning, the first Sunday without a phone call, the slow and deliberate construction of a life that required no one's permission, that was not revenge. I want to be careful about that word because it implies a targeting, a deliberate wounding, a satisfaction taken in someone else's pain. That was not my experience. My experience was more interior than that. It was the experience of a woman who stopped arranging herself around other people's comfort and discovered in the space that opened up that she was considerably larger than she had believed. The commercial property generates income that funds my consultancy's operating costs. My business turns 18 months old next month. I'm buying my first property, no longer a big idea, simply a fact in progress. I cook elaborate Sunday dinners for myself and sometimes for friends, and I eat them at my table with a candle lit, and I find, regularly, that this is enough. My mother and I have a relationship. Careful, reduced, honest in a way it never was when I was performing acceptance. I do not carry rage toward her. I carry something more complex, a clear-eyed tenderness for who she was capable of being, and a clear-eyed acceptance of the distance between that and who she chose to be. Deborah and I do not speak. Priya and I speak occasionally. The geography of the family has been reorganized around accurate information rather than inherited assumption, and I find that geography, though smaller, fits me considerably better. Here is what I would tell the woman in the red dress if I could reach her. The empty chair they gave you was not a punishment, it was a map. It showed you exactly where you actually were in the architecture of that family, not where you had believed yourself to be, not where your labor had earned you the right to be, but where you actually were. And once a map is accurate, you can navigate. You navigated. Betrayal at its most fundamental is a failure of accurate seeing. The people who betrayed you failed to see you clearly. The real task, the one that takes years and is worth every one of them, is learning to see yourself clearly in spite of that. Not in defiance of it, not to prove anything to anyone, simply to know from the inside out, without anyone's confirmation, what you are worth. You are not what an empty gift table says you are. You are what you build in the silence after. Have you ever been overlooked by the people who were supposed to see you most clearly? What was the moment you decided to stop waiting to be chosen? Share your story in the comments. And if you're somewhere in the middle of yours, not yet at the other side, I want you to know that the fact that you're still here, still seeking, still trying to understand what happened to you, means the building is already underway. This was another story from Revenge Room, where we turn pain into purpose and betrayal into balance. If this story reached you today, please subscribe and join us for the next transformation. Every story we tell is for someone who needed to hear it.